Hi, I'm Anoosh. I'm joined by Freddie and Andrew to talk about the end of party conference season. Well, let's talk about Conservative Party conference first, because you've just come from there.
I think the Conservative Party conference, in terms of unity, sense of purpose, sense that they're going to be in power for a long time, was the worst I have ever seen of any party. It was really, really grim for the Tories. The number of people in the bars and in the sort of corridors and so forth talking as if they were sure they were going into opposition. Now they're facing opinion polls, some of them putting Labour 33 points ahead, so it's not surprising, but that has really got under the skin of Tory MPs who think that their careers are over. And that then sparked all the conversations about would there be a coup, how are we going to do, would she turn policy. A lot of senior Conservatives at conference went in to see the new Prime Minister and said, I've only said Theresa May, the new Prime Minister, and said, look, this 45p thing is killing us, you have to reverse it. And she apparently just looked up, didn't say anything at all really, but clearly was listening. That took a little bit of the poison out, but it was a really, really tough conference. Her speech was not a disaster at the end. Low bar, but she passed it.
Yeah, I think it was, in some respects, the beginning of the end of Liz Truss, because the disunity was so widespread. We had MPs, cabinet ministers contradicting each other hour by hour. There was no sense of unity or discipline, and that's a massive problem for a Prime Minister. You've got to remember that they have to rely on a majority in the House of Commons. They have to be able to get through legislation through. And as soon as that authority dissipates, well, then you have to start questioning their position.
Yes, because how is she going to do this move fast and break things attitude? Lift the fracking ban, overhaul planning legislation, all of these quite radical things she wants to do that a lot of Conservative MPs are worried about. Can she actually do any of that?
So we shouldn't make predictions generally, but for sure she's not going to get fracking through. For sure she's not going to get the radical planning ideas through. And I think for sure, for instance, she's not going to get a freeze on benefits through either. There are so many Tory MPs from all wings of the party. When you've got Nadine Dorries saying publicly that you're too right-wing, you're in trouble.
Yes, well, just a bit on the speech. I noticed that she lashed out at people like us at one point, podcasters and broadcasters, who she lumped in with the enemies of enterprise and the anti-growth coalition, which included Labour and the Lib Dems, the unions, environmental activists and things. Is this the new anti-woke brigade, or citizens of nowhere, or metropolitan elite? How many times are they going to try and pick a scapegoat?
Well, I think she was trying to do multiple things with that. She was obviously trying to distract from the fiasco of the budget. She was also trying to tap into some of the populist feeling that's animated British politics over the past 10 years. The reason I don't think that's going to work is, to be a populist, you have to be in some respects popular, and there aren't many popular policies that Truss is advocating. And Andrew, you wrote about this in your piece this week, that some of the more popular policies that brought about Brexit, lower immigration, higher public spending, more money for the NHS, are complete opposite of what Liz Truss is now proposing.
Yes, I think there were different versions of Brexit really in the minds of the Brexiteers themselves. I think in the country there was a kind of small c Conservative idea of Brexit. Let's go back a little bit, let's have a slightly more ordered, kinder, gentler, and frankly whiter country.
Golf club Brexit.
Golf club Brexit, exactly. 19th hole Brexit. And then a relatively small group of real free market radicals, as our colleague Jeremy Cliff wrote so brilliantly in the magazine, coming out of the Tufton Street think tanks, the IEA and the Taxpayers Alliance and so forth, whose idea was, no, Brexit gives us an opportunity to make a radical break with the sort of social democratic consensus of the 20th century, and we can go roaring ahead. Let the markets kind of rule, let's have a more Americanized, faster moving, as it were, less reliable country. That emphasis on change and disruption, which Liz Truss talks about, let's have more disruption. Now that group, I think, was quite small originally inside the Conservative Party, quite small inside the Brexit movement, but bit by bit in the extraordinary politics that we've seen since, frankly, David Cameron, the fall of David Cameron, then the torture and the nightmare of Theresa May, and then the Boris Johnson years and the intervention of COVID and so forth, and now into what's happened since. That small revolutionary group has taken more and more and more power and is now in, I was going to say complete power, but of course it's not in complete power, because if it can't get its legislation through, it has very little power at all.
And you wrote in your cover story this week for this week's New Statesman that this version of the Brexit revolution is now eating its children, Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng being its children.
They're really, you almost feel sorry for them. You can see their faces, they can't quite understand why everything is going wrong quite so quickly. They can't understand why they're not surrounded by genuinely enthusiastic party members on all sides. And they certainly can't understand when they're told they're not going to get this thing through. And the markets, they've always loved the markets. And look how the markets are treating them now. Very, very poor behaviour by the markets, I would say. Very ungenerous, unkind.
Well, I've been speaking to some people, particularly on low incomes, part-time work, on universal credit, to hear their reactions to how the speech and also the general sort of mayhem has been coming across. And they've just felt that it's been completely detached from reality, some of the things that Liz Truss has been speaking about. I spoke to one NHS worker who works part-time, she's a single mum, and she was saying that every day she's so stressed about money that she thinks that's one more day down, another day ahead. She can't think, she can't enjoy her life, she can't think ahead. She was saying it was surviving, not living. That's to do with not just this hanging over them that benefits might not go up with inflation, which, Andrew, I think you're right, they probably wouldn't manage to get that through anyway. But there was also a change in the mini budget to benefits, more sanctions for people if they don't spend longer hours looking for work or higher paid work.
They're now in this trap where if they're going to calm the markets and reassure international investors, and money is stopping coming into the UK at the moment, if they're going to do that, they have to convince the markets that they have control over spending in the long term. That means some kind of cuts. And we've talked about welfare, but also departmental budgets. If they hold departmental budgets down during a period of inflation, that's a real terms cut. That will be felt by schools, it'll be felt by the criminal justice system and the police, and it will be felt by the NHS. And that is another of the big problems coming, I think, ahead this winter.
Yeah, so it's going to get even more unpopular once they set out the consequences of the mini budget. But I think also it's an admission of failure. I mean, we've spoken about this before, but as soon as they say, actually, we can't fund these tax cuts through growth, we have to fund them through public spending cuts, then it completely undermines their whole argument. This whole time has been, well, don't worry about it because we're going to have the growth. Well,
how do you have growth if you start cutting infrastructure projects and investment?
Well, exactly. I mean,
it will be taking money out of capital budgets to put into day-to-day spending on things like the NHS.
I would say in crude terms, the analysis that she's got is right. We are too low growth. Like lots of Western countries, we have allowed ourselves to become less innovative, less hard-working in some respects in terms of productivity. That's not because of workers, that's because of capital and management as much as anything else. But there is a problem in the economy. It's been there for a long term and it does need to be resolved. The analysis is fine, the response is not.
Labour have been talking about growth for a long time. Back in July, Starmer had a speech where he said his three priorities were growth, growth, growth. And then Liz Truss just appropriated that term. So the political debate at the moment is on growth. It's about how you achieve that. And if we see the numbers not come through for Truss over the next 3 months or 4 months or so, people will start looking even more towards Starmer's package and think, actually, is this the way that we're going to achieve growth?
Well, yes, Andrew, we haven't spoken to you about your reflections on Labour conference yet, so I just wondered how you felt how that went.
We talk about conference season, and I think there's an element in which one conference is always balanced against another. It's a story of multiple conferences. And of course, the poor Lib Dems didn't have their conference this year because of the death of the Queen. But there could not have been a greater contrast between the Labour conference, patriotism, discipline, order, organisation and policy, and what happened at the Tory. Liz Truss said in her speech the Labour Party had no policies anymore. That's absolutely not true. If you look at the Great British Energy and you look at their plans for a green industrial revolution and you look at their plans on house building, there's a lot of policy actually in Keir Starmer's speech. I thought it was one of the best leaders' speeches I have heard for many, many years, possibly decades, and was a pivot in terms of the national conversation. I think it was the moment when you could suddenly see that Labour is almost certainly heading for power. We were waiting to see if the Conservatives had a really robust response at their conference, and the best that Liz Truss could come up with was the anti-growth coalition. It's not a bad phrase, I can see it on people's T-shirts. But the problem with
Which is important.
It's important, anti-growth coalition. But if you add together the kind of North London intelligentsia, three people as it were, the trade union movement, all the members and supporters of the opposition parties and everybody who doesn't like Brexit, well, you have a large majority of the entire country, which is her problem politically. And that's what the opinion polls are showing.
Yes, and one last thing which MPs on both sides actually say is the word growth doesn't necessarily mean much to the ordinary voter. Yeah. I mean, what does it mean? I mean, people are facing, on average, £1,000 up on their mortgage repayments. I mean,
quite. I wrote about this in today's morning call. When politicians talk about GDP or GNI or CPI or RPI, they don't mean much to normal people. What growth means is you have more money in your pocket. It means you have higher wages. It means prices are slightly more stable. It means you can afford your mortgage. And if we don't see those things come about, then the growth message completely falls apart.
And to be fair to Liz Truss, because we are a fair-minded publication always, actually the one bit of her speech when she said, I grew up in Paisley and in Leeds in the 80s and 90s, of course, much of that Conservative Party period, and there wasn't enough growth, and what that meant was people couldn't feed their families properly. She then gave a very real-world example of what the lack of growth actually felt like. I thought that bit was quite good.
And we also learned quite a bit about her political motivation as well. She spoke about being belittled as a northern woman and how she's always seen herself as a bit of an outsider. So I think that you can see that play through right now, I think.